I watched helplessly as tears streamed down Angela's face. Her shoulders hunched forward like she was trying to disappear. Across the courtroom, Victoria Harrington smirked, whispering something to her expensive attorney while pointing at my client's second-hand suit. The courtroom felt like it was closing in on us as Victoria's attorney stood up, his voice dripping with condescension. "Your Honor, Ms. Palmer is clearly unfit to manage the inheritance. Just look at her, she can barely manage herself." I gripped my legal pad so hard my knuckles turned white, the smell of lemon-scented cleaner in the courtroom suddenly nauseating. But then Judge Reynolds picked up that weathered manila envelope, the one I'd filed just yesterday, and everything changed. The mockery in Victoria's eyes is something I'll never forget. The way she looked at Angela like she was nothing worse than nothing, like she was something to be scraped off the bottom of a shoe. I've been a legal aid attorney for 37 years, but in all that time, I'd never seen someone so determined to crush another human being. Not just win a case, but destroy someone's spirit. Victoria wanted the satisfaction of watching Angela crumble, piece by piece, in front of everyone, and for a moment, it seemed like she was going to get exactly what she wanted, until that envelope changed everything. I still remember the exact sound of Judge Reynolds clearing his throat before he started reading. It was like the entire courtroom held its breath all at once. The ceiling fan above us squeaked with every third rotation, tick, tick, squeak, tick, tick, squeak, marking the seconds as they passed. Judge Reynolds adjusted his glasses, the fluorescent lights reflecting off his silver frames as he opened the unsealed envelope with careful fingers. No one knew what was inside except me, and soon, the evidence that I'd spent months gathering would finally see the light of day. The judge's expression shifted as his eyes moved down the page, from professional neutrality to something else entirely. Something I'd never seen on his face in all my years practicing in his courtroom. "I believe," he said, his voice cutting through the silence, "that everyone needs to hear this." And that's when Victoria Harrington's perfectly composed face began to crack. That's when I knew we had her. That's when justice finally had a chance. I need to take you back to how this all began. 15 months ago, on a rainy Tuesday morning, Angela Palmer walked into my office at Lakeside Legal Aid. I wasn't supposed to be there. I was covering for my colleague Sarah, who had the flu, but sometimes fate puts you exactly where you need to be. Angela was soaking wet, her gray hair plastered to her face, clutching a plastic grocery bag filled with crumpled papers. She wasn't on the schedule. She didn't have an appointment. She just stood there in the doorway, water pooling around her worn sneakers on our already stained carpet. Looking lost. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They told me to come back tomorrow, but I don't think I can do this again. It took everything I had to come here today." There was something in her eyes, a profound weariness mixed with determination that made me wave her in. "I'll make time," I told her, clearing a stack of files from the chair across from my desk. As she sat down, I noticed how her hands trembled as she tried to smooth out the papers she'd brought. I would later learn she'd been carrying those papers around for weeks, afraid to show them to anyone but equally afraid to let them out of her sight. Angela was 68 years old, a retired school librarian. Her husband, Robert, had passed away 7 months earlier after a brief but brutal battle with pancreatic cancer. They'd been married for 43 years, high school sweethearts who'd built a modest but happy life together in their small 2-bedroom house on Maple Street. They never had children, but they had each other, their books, and their garden. Robert always said, "We grew love in that garden," she told me, a ghost of a smile crossing her face. 43 years of tomatoes and roses and love. The way she said it so matter-of-factly, yet with such profound grief, made my throat tight. What Angela didn't know until after Robert died was that he had a life insurance policy worth $750,000. It wasn't the kind of money that would make headlines, but for someone who had lived modestly her entire life, surviving on a librarian's pension, it was life-changing. "We always lived paycheck to paycheck," she explained. "I thought I'd have to sell the house after he died. I didn't know how I'd manage the property taxes next year, let alone the leaky roof." When the insurance check arrived, Angela described it as breathing room, not luxury, just the ability to keep living in the home where she and Robert had built their life together. That's where Victoria Harrington entered the picture. Victoria was Robert's niece, his sister's daughter. She was 45, a real estate agent with an office in the wealthy part of town, with the kind of polished appearance that screamed ambition and success. According to Angela, Victoria had never been close to her uncle. She'd show up for Christmas sometimes, always with expensive gifts that felt more like showing off than actual presents. Robert would say, "That's just Vicky's way," and invite her in anyway. The kindness Robert showed to his niece would prove to be Angela's undoing. 3 weeks after Robert's funeral, Victoria started calling Angela regularly. At first, it seemed like genuine concern, offering to help with paperwork, bringing over meals, checking in on her aunt by marriage. Angela was grateful for the company during those dark days of early grief. "It's like the world expects you to be done mourning after the funeral," Angela said, twisting a tissue in her hands. "But that's when the real loneliness starts, when everyone goes back to their lives and you're just there, in a house that's suddenly too quiet." I'd ask you to imagine that silence. For a moment, the absence of someone who's been part of your daily life for over 4 decades. The empty chair at the breakfast table. The cold side of the bed. The conversations you catch yourself starting with someone who isn't there anymore. Victoria's visits increased when she learned about the insurance money. She said she was worried about me managing such a large sum at my age, Angela explained, her voice hardening slightly. She kept saying things like, "Aunt Angie, you shouldn't have to worry about finances while you're grieving." At first, I thought she was being kind. It started with small suggestions. Victoria offered to help. Angela set up a new bank account to keep the insurance money separate. She brought over financial magazines, highlighting investment opportunities that couldn't miss. She introduced Angela to her trusted financial advisor, a man named Marcus who spoke quickly and used terms Angela didn't understand. Before she realized what was happening, Angela had signed papers giving Victoria co-signing authority on her new account, just in case something happens to you. "Aunt Angie, you live alone now," Victoria explained. It was for emergency access only, a safety measure that any responsible person would take. What she didn't explain was that the paperwork actually gave her full access to the account at any time, without Angela's knowledge or consent. I'll never forget the way Angela's voice broke when she told me. I trusted her because she was Robert's blood. I thought that meant something. The first withdrawal happened 3 days after the account was set up. $25,000 transferred to Victoria's personal account. When Angela questioned it, Victoria said it was for investment purposes and that she'd have the paperwork soon. The second withdrawal came a week later, $50,000 this time. When Angela called Victoria, increasingly concerned, Victoria explained that she was diversifying the portfolio and that Angela shouldn't worry her pretty little head about it. By the time Angela came to see me, Victoria had transferred a total of $327,500 out of the account in just under 6 weeks. "I finally went to the bank yesterday," Angela told me, pulling a bank statement from her plastic bag. "The manager showed me all the transfers. When I told him I hadn't authorized them, he showed me the account agreement I'd signed." Her hands shook as she passed me the statement. "He said legally, there was nothing he could do. Victoria had every right to move that money." I studied the document, noting the dates and amounts of each transfer. 7 separate transactions, each one larger than the last, as if Victoria was testing the waters before diving in completely. What made this situation particularly devastating wasn't just the financial loss, it was the betrayal from someone who should have been family, someone who had exploited Angela's vulnerability during the darkest period of her life. "She knew I was grieving," Angela said, her voice barely audible. "She knew I couldn't think straight some days. There were times I couldn't remember if I'd eaten breakfast or not. And she used that against me." I asked Angela if she'd confronted Victoria about the transfers. Her answer chilled me. "I called her yesterday after leaving the bank." She laughed. She actually laughed and said, "It's my money now, Aunt Angie. You signed it over. Maybe next time read what you're signing." That laugh would come back to haunt Victoria later. I still have the yellow legal pad where I wrote down Angela's story that day. The pages are filled with my handwriting, growing increasingly agitated as the details unfolded. By the time she finished talking, I had 3 pages of notes and a knot of anger in my stomach. What Victoria had done wasn't just morally reprehensibly danced on the line of legality. The question was whether we could prove that she had deliberately misled Angela about the nature of the documents she was signing. The fact that Victoria had moved so quickly to drain the account worked in our favor, suggested premeditation rather than opportunity. "Can you help me?" Angela asked when she'd finished her story. She looked so small in that moment, drowning in a cardigan that had once belonged to her husband. I thought about the mountain we'd have to climb Victoria's resources against our underfunded legal aid office. Angela's word against the legal documents she'd admittedly signed. I thought about how cases like this often ended, with the vulnerable person losing everything while the predator walked away unscathed. But I also thought about what it would mean to turn her away. "Yes," I said, reaching across the desk to cover her trembling hand with mine. "We're going to fight this, Ms. Palmer. I promise you that." The relief in her eyes was palpable, but I was careful not to promise victory, only a fight. I didn't know then that this case would consume the next 15 months of my professional life. I didn't know that Victoria Harrington would prove to be not just greedy, but vindictive. I didn't know that I would find myself lying awake at night, turning over strategies in my mind, or that I would fill 7 legal pads with notes and plans and frustrated scribblings. But looking back, I wouldn't change a thing, because some fights need to be fought, no matter the cost. Some injustices can't be allowed to stand. And sometimes, the universe places you exactly where you need to be, like being in the office on a rainy Tuesday when you were supposed to be off, just in time to meet someone who needs you. Our first step was to file for an emergency injunction to freeze the remaining funds, $422.5 before Victoria could transfer them out as well. We appeared before Judge Reynolds 3 days later, with Angela clutching her purse so tightly her knuckles were white. Victoria arrived, 10 minutes late, dressed in a tailored red suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary, flanked by not one but 2 attorneys from Caldwell and Barnes, the most expensive firm in our county. One look at their matching leather briefcases told me everything I needed to know about how seriously Victoria was taking this threat. The courtroom that day smelled of furniture polish and anxiety. Judge Reynolds, a man in his 60s with salt and pepper hair and reading glasses perpetually perched on the end of his nose, reviewed our petition. With the careful deliberation he was known for, Victoria's lead attorney, James Caldwell himself, argued smoothly that his client had legal authority to access the funds based on the signed account agreement. "Your Honor, this is simply a case of someone regretting a decision they knowingly made," he said, his voice like honey. "Ms. Palmer gave my client co-signing authority. The bank verified the documentation. There's no emergency here. Just an elderly woman, confused about financial matters." I felt Angela stiffen beside me at the word elderly. At 68, she was hardly incapacitated, and the implications stung. When it was my turn to speak, I emphasized the suspicious timing and pattern of the withdrawals, as well as Angela's vulnerable state following her husband's death. "Your Honor, Ms. Harrington began removing funds within days of gaining access funds from a life insurance policy intended to support Ms. Palmer in her widowhood. There was no investment portfolio as promised. The money was transferred directly to Ms. Harrington's personal accounts. I submitted the bank statements as evidence, pointing out the 7 transfers. Judge Reynolds studied the documents, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Caldwell, can your client provide documentation of these alleged investments made on Ms. Palmer's behalf?" he asked. Caldwell hesitated for just a fraction of a second, long enough for me to know we'd found our first crack in their defense. "We can provide those at a later date, Your Honor. My client is a busy professional and wasn't aware she needed to bring her financial records today." Judge Reynolds peered at him over his reading glasses. "I see. And these substantial transfers, nearly half the total amount, were made without any documentation provided to Ms. Palmer." Victoria leaned forward and whispered something to Caldwell, who nodded before responding. "Your Honor, my client was in the process of gathering the appropriate documentation. These are complex investments that require time to properly document." Judge Reynolds made a note on his pad. "I'm granting the emergency injunction to freeze the remaining funds pending further investigation," he said. "And Mr. Caldwell, I expect those investment records on my desk by Monday morning. All of them." Victoria's face flushed with anger, a muscle in her jaw twitching visibly from where I sat. As we left the courtroom, Victoria brushed past Angela with enough force to make her stumble. "You'll regret this," she hissed. "Just loud enough for us to hear, but not enough to catch the bailiff's attention. I have friends you couldn't even imagine. You're just a pathetic old woman who doesn't know her place." I steadied Angela and stepped between them. "Save it for the courtroom, Miss Harrington," I said quietly. "Every threat just makes our case stronger." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," she said, before turning on her designer heel and walking away. "I'll tell you exactly what was in those so-called investment records when we receive them on Monday. But first, I need to explain something about Angela that I learned during our second meeting. 2 days after our hearing, we met in my office to prepare for the next steps. Angela brought a photo album, a weathered blue book with gold trim, the kind people made before everything became digital. "I wanted you to see who Robert was," she said, opening to the first page. "Since you're fighting for what he left me." The album was a chronicle of their life together from prom. Pictures in the 1970s through their wedding, their first house, holidays, vacations, and quiet moments in between. Robert Palmer had been a tall man with kind eyes and a smile that took up his whole face. In every photo, he was looking at Angela like she was the center of his universe. Towards the end of the album, there was a photo of Robert standing beside a young Victoria at what appeared to be her college graduation. "He paid for her degree," Angela said quietly. "Victoria's parents, Robert's sister and her husband, they struggled financially. Robert worked overtime for 4 years to help put Victoria through business school. He said education was the greatest gift you could give someone." She turned the page to a more recent photo, Christmas dinner about 5 years earlier. Robert was carving a turkey while Victoria sat at the table, engrossed in her phone. He always invited her for holidays, even when she barely acknowledged him. He said family was family, no matter what. The revelation of Robert's generosity towards Victoria made her betrayal of Angela even more callous. Monday morning arrived, and with it, the promised investment documentation from Victoria's attorneys. The packet was impressively thickety, 7 pages of financial statements, prospectuses, and account agreements. At first glance, it looked legitimate. There were colorful graphs showing projected returns, official-looking statements from companies with impressive-sounding names, and detailed breakdowns of how Angela's money had supposedly been allocated. But something felt off. I'd handled enough financial fraud cases to develop an instinct for deception, and this packet was setting off all my internal alarms. I spent that entire day and night going through the documents line by line, page by page. By 2 a.m., fueled by too much coffee and righteous indignation, I found what I was looking for: discrepancies in the dates. According to the investment statements, some of the accounts had been opened 3 weeks before Victoria had even gained access to Angela's funds. Others showed transactions on weekends when financial markets were closed. I circled each inconsistency in red, creating a timeline that made it impossible for these investments to be legitimate. But the smoking gun came on page 63, on account statement for a company called Harrington Heights LLC that was supposedly managing $175,000 of Angela's money. A quick business registry search revealed that Harrington Heights was a real estate development company owned solely by Victoria Harrington. She hadn't even bothered to disguise the self-dealing. The next morning, bleary-eyed but determined, I filed a motion for emergency relief, requesting the court to order Victoria to return all funds pending a full hearing. I attached my analysis of the fraudulent documentation as an exhibit. Judge Reynolds scheduled an emergency hearing for the following day. When we arrived at the courthouse, Victoria and her attorneys were already there, huddled in intense conversation. Victoria looked immaculate as always, but there was a tightness around her eyes that hadn't been there before. She glanced up as we entered, her gaze falling on the expandable folder in my hands that contained our evidence. Something flickered across her face: concern, perhaps, or calculation. Judge Reynolds called the court to order, and I presented our findings first. I walked through the timeline discrepancies, pointing out the impossible dates and transactions. "Your Honor," I said, "page 63 is particularly troubling. It shows that $175,000 of Ms. Palmer's money was transferred to Harrington Heights LLC, a company owned exclusively by the defendant. This isn't an investment on Ms. Palmer's behalf, It's Ms. Harrington investing in herself, using someone else's money. I submitted the business registry documentation to support my claim. Judge Reynolds reviewed it carefully, his expression growing increasingly stern. When it was Caldwell's turn to respond, he switched tactics entirely. Your Honor, while there may be some clerical errors in the documentation for which we apologize, the fundamental fact remains that Ms. Palmer granted my client legal authority to manage these funds. Whether she now regrets that decision is immaterial to the legality of the arrangement. It was a bold pivot, essentially abandoning the pretense that these were legitimate investments and falling back on the signed account agreement. Victoria sat beside him, her face a careful mask of professional concern, but her fingers drummed an anxious rhythm on the table. Judge Reynolds removed his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose, a gesture I'd seen many times before when he was particularly disturbed by something. Mr. Caldwell, he said finally, are you now acknowledging that the investment documentation previously submitted to this court contains falsified information? Caldwell hesitated, clearly caught between admitting to submitting fraudulent evidence and continuing a lie that had been exposed. We're acknowledging that there may have been administrative errors in preparing the documentation, Your Honor, nothing more. The judge wasn't having it. I find that deeply concerning. Counselor, this court takes the submission of accurate documentation very seriously. He turned to Victoria. Ms. Harrington, as a licensed real estate professional, you're held to certain ethical standards regarding financial transactions. Did you personally review these documents before they were submitted to the court? Victoria straightened in her chair. I trusted my financial team to prepare them, Your Honor. I may not have reviewed every page in detail. It was a careful non-answer that attempted to distance herself from the fraudulent documents. Judge Reynolds made a note before looking back at me. Ms. Davis, your motion for emergency relief is granted. The defendant is ordered to return all withdrawn funds, $327,5 to the court's escrow account within 72 hours. Furthermore, I'm referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for review of potential criminal charges related to financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult and submitting falsified documents to the court. Victoria's composure finally cracked, her face paled, and she gripped the edge of the table. Caldwell immediately requested a sidebar, which the judge granted. I couldn't hear what was said during the intense 3-minute conversation between Caldwell and Judge Reynolds, but when they returned, the judge's expression was, if possible, even grimmer. The court stands by its ruling. Funds to be returned within 72 hours. We're adjourned, as Victoria and her legal team hurriedly gathered their things. I caught a glimpse of something I hadn't expected to see on Victoria Harrington's perfect-faced fear. She knew she'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But what I didn't know then was that this was just the beginning of her retaliation against Angela. The next morning, I received a call from Angela that made my blood run cold. She was sobbing so hard I could barely understand her. They're saying I have dementia. She finally managed to get out between gasps. Victoria is filing for guardianship. She says I'm mentally incompetent and can't manage my own affairs. I told Angela to stay calm and not to speak to anyone until I got there. 20 minutes later, I was at her small house on Maple Street, where a man in a suit was attempting to serve her with guardianship papers. I identified myself as her attorney and accepted service on her behalf, sending the process server on his way before he could further upset Angela. Guardianship petition was a masterpiece of malicious fiction. It claimed that Angela had been showing signs of cognitive decline for years, that she frequently forgot to pay bills or take medication, that she got lost in familiar places, and that she was susceptible to financial scams. Ironically, the very thing Victoria herself had perpetrated. The petition requested that Victoria be named as Angela's legal guardian with full control over her person and property for her own protection. Most disturbing was an attached affidavit from Dr. Marcus Hendricks, the same financial advisor Victoria had introduced to Angela, who now claimed to have observed concerning cognitive behaviors during their meetings. This is ridiculous, Angela said, her hands shaking as she read through the petition. I've never been diagnosed with dementia or any cognitive problem. My doctor just gave me a clean bill of health at my annual checkup last month. That gave me an idea. When exactly was your checkup, and who's your doctor? I asked. Angela told me her appointment with Dr. Sarah Chen at Lakeside Medical Group had been on April 12, just 17 days earlier. I immediately called Dr. Chen's office, explaining the situation and requesting an emergency cognitive assessment and letter regarding Angela's mental capacity. Dr. Chen agreed to see Angela that afternoon. She conducted a thorough evaluation, including a mini mental state examination, which Angela passed with flying colors. Dr. Chen also reviewed Angela's medical history, noting that there had never been any concerns about her cognitive function. "This is troubling," Dr. Chen said as she typed up her findings. "Using false claims of dementia as a weapon is not only unethical, but potentially harmful to the patient. The stress alone from these accusations could negatively impact Ms. Palmer's health." She provided us with a comprehensive letter stating unequivocally that Angela showed no signs of cognitive impairment and was fully capable of managing her own affairs. Armed with Dr. Chen's assessment, I filed our response to the guardianship petition the next morning, along with a motion to dismiss the case and a request for sanctions against Victoria for filing a frivolous petition. I also began preparing for the possibility that Victoria wouldn't return the $327,500 as ordered by Judge Reynolds. The 72-hour deadline would expire at 2 p.m. the following day, and I had a sinking feeling that Victoria might try to claim she didn't have the funds available, that they were tied up in investments or otherwise inaccessible. I decided we needed to track the money trail more aggressively. I contacted a forensic accountant I'd worked with on previous cases, Elaine Winters, a retired IRS investigator who now consulted on financial fraud cases. Elaine agreed to review the bank records, and Victoria submitted documentation right away. "Give me 48 hours, she said. "If the money's still in the country, I'll find it." I transmitted all our files to her secure server and turned my attention back to fighting the guardianship petition. The next day brought two significant developments. First, as I'd feared, Victoria's attorney filed a motion for an extension of time to return the funds, claiming that the investments needed to be liquidated, and this process would take at least 30 days. Second, and more surprisingly, I received a call from a woman named Diane Foster who identified herself as Victoria's former assistant at her real estate office. "I saw Ms. Palmer's name in some documents I shouldn't have seen," she said, her voice hesitant. "And I heard conversations between Victoria and her financial advisor. Things that didn't seem right. I've been debating whether to call you for days." I asked Diane if she'd be willing to meet in person, and she agreed to come to my office after work. At 5:30 that evening, a nervous-looking woman in her early 30s arrived, constantly glancing over her shoulder as if afraid she'd been followed. Once seated in my office with the door closed, Diane's story came pouring out. She had worked as Victoria's executive assistant for 3 years until 2 weeks ago, when she'd been abruptly fired for insubordination, which, according to Diane, actually meant questioning Victoria about some concerning practices she'd observed. "It started with the Palmer file," Diane explained. "Victoria came in the day after her uncle's funeral and said she had a project she needed help with. She had me research elder financial abuse laws, specifically what constituted legal consent versus exploitation. Diane had found this odd but had compiled the requested information. A week later, Victoria had asked her to create a document that looked like an official investment summary but wasn't actually connected to any real accounts. She said it was for a marketing presentation, but something felt off about it. When I asked questions, she got angry and told me to just do my job. Most damning was what Diane had overheard 3 weeks before she was fired: a phone conversation between Victoria and Dr. Marcus Hendricks. Victoria was in her office with the door not quite closed. I heard her say, "I don't care what you have to write in that affidavit, Marcus. Make it convincing that she's losing it. Remember, you owe me for covering up that licensing issue last year." When she saw me standing near the door afterward, she gave me this looked like she was calculating something. The next day, my workload doubled. 2 weeks later, I was fired. Diane had brought copies of emails and notes she'd kept, documentation that supported her account of Victoria's deliberate plan to defraud Angela and then attempt to have her declared incompetent when she fought back. The emails included exchanges between Victoria and Marcus Hendricks discussing their strategy regarding Angela, as well as a particularly incriminating message to the legal team that referred to the guardianship petition as Plan B if the old lady doesn't back down. While Victoria had been careful not to put the most explicit parts of her scheme in writing, there was enough circumstantial evidence to establish a pattern of calculated deception. "I could lose everything by telling you this," Diane said, her hands trembling as she pushed a thumb drive across my desk. "Victoria has connections everywhere in this town. She could make sure I never work here again." Assured Diane that we would protect her identity as much as legally possible and that her information would be critical in helping an innocent woman recover her life savings. "There's one more thing," Diane added as she stood to leave. "Victoria has another property, a cabin, registered under her mother's maiden name in the mountains. She keeps a safe there. She once told me that's where she puts things no one can ever find. That information would prove crucial in the days ahead." While I was meeting with Diane, Elaine Winters was following the money trail. She called me early the next morning, excitement evident in her normally measured voice. "I've got it," she said. "Victoria didn't even try that hard to hide the funds. $175,000 went directly into Harrington Heights LLC, as you discovered. Another $75,000 was transferred to a personal account at First National under Victoria's name. But here's where it gets interesting. The remaining $77,500 was moved to an offshore account in the Caymans, and then immediately transferred back to a domestic account under the name Camden Trust. A quick search revealed that Camden was Victoria's middle name. She created a shell game, but not a very sophisticated one," Elaine concluded. "I've documented all the transfers. She definitely has access to these funds and could return them immediately if ordered to do so." Armed with both Diane's evidence and Elaine's financial tracking, I filed an emergency motion for contempt regarding Victoria's failure to return the funds as ordered, along with our evidence that the money was accessible. I also submitted our response to the guardianship petition with Dr. Chen's medical evaluation and requested an expedited hearing on both matters. Judge Reynolds consolidated the cases and scheduled a hearing for the following Monday, 4 days away. Those 4 days were some of the most intense of my career. Victoria's attorneys filed motion after motion trying to disqualify Judge Reynolds for bias, attempting to exclude Diane's evidence as stolen company property, and even filing a complaint against me with the State Bar Association for witness tampering. Each attack required a response. Each response took precious time away from preparing for Monday's hearing. I worked through the weekend, stopping only for brief naps on the couch in my office. By Monday morning, I had dark circles under my eyes but a comprehensive case prepared. The courthouse was unusually crowded that Monday. Word had spread about the contentious case, and several of Angela's former colleagues from the school library had come to show support. They sat in a group behind us, a sea of gray and white heads, united in solidarity. Victoria arrived with her legal team and a man I recognized from her documentation as Dr. Marcus Hendricks, a thin, nervous-looking individual who couldn't seem to make eye contact with anyone. Victoria herself looked polished as ever in a navy suit, but there was a brittleness to her smile that hadn't been there before. Judge Reynolds entered, and the room fell silent. He began by addressing the contempt motion regarding the unreturned funds. Victoria's attorney argued that his client had made good faith efforts to liquidate the investments but needed more time. Judge Reynolds referred to Elaine Winters' financial analysis, which I'd submitted with our motion. According to this expert report, the funds are currently in accounts directly controlled by Ms. Harrington, he said. "Mr. Caldwell, can you explain why your client hasn't complied with this court's order to return these funds?" Before Caldwell could answer, Victoria leaned over and whispered urgently in his ear. He looked uncomfortable but nodded. "Your Honor, my client disputes the findings in that report. Furthermore, she questions how this information was obtained, as it appears to rely on internal company documents that may have been illegally accessed." Judge Reynolds frowned. "That doesn't address the question of why she hasn't returned the funds. Is Ms. Harrington claiming she doesn't have access to $327,500? That was in her accounts just days ago, according to her own submitted statements." Caldwell hesitated, clearly caught in a difficult position. "Your Honor, my client is prepared to return the funds, but requests 30 days to do so without penalty." Judge Reynolds' expression hardened. The original order gave her 72 hours. That deadline expired 5 days ago. I'm finding Ms. Harrington in contempt of court. She has until 5 p.m. today to transfer the full amount to the court's escrow account, or she will be taken into custody until the funds are produced. Victoria's face flushed with anger, but she remained silent as the judge moved on to the guardianship petition. This is where things truly began to unravel for Victoria Harrington. Judge Reynolds reviewed Dr. Chun's medical evaluation, noting that it was conducted just 3 weeks after Victoria claimed Angela was showing signs of severe cognitive impairment. He then turned to Dr. Hendricks, who was present to testify about his observations of Angela's alleged mental decline. Dr. Hendricks, the judge began, "What is your medical specialty?" Hendricks shifted uncomfortably. "I'm not a medical doctor, Your Honor. I have a PhD in finance." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Yet you've provided a sworn affidavit making medical claims about Ms. Palmer's cognitive state. On what basis did you make these assessments?" Hendricks glanced at Victoria, who stared straight ahead. "I observed behaviors during our financial consultations that seemed consistent with confusion." Judge Reynolds pressed further. "What specific training do you have in recognizing cognitive impairment or dementia?" Hendricks swallowed hard. "None, specifically, Your Honor." The judge made a note before continuing. "And how many times did you meet with Ms. Palmer?" Hendricks hesitated. "Twice, Your Honor. For about an hour each time." Judge Reynolds looked genuinely disturbed. "So you're offering a medical opinion about a woman's cognitive capacity based on 2 hours of observation, with no medical training, in meetings that were ostensibly about financial matters?" Before Hendricks could respond, I requested permission to present our newly acquired evidence. When granted, I submitted Diane Foster's documentation, including the emails between Victoria and Hendricks discussing their strategy and the damning message about Plan B, if the old lady doesn't back down. As Judge Reynolds reviewed these materials, the courtroom remained utterly silent. Victoria's attorney requested a recess to confer with his client, but the judge denied it. "We'll continue," he said firmly. I called Diane Foster to testify. Despite her obvious nervousness, she spoke clearly about what she had witnessed during her employment with Victoria: the research into elder financial abuse laws, the fabricated investment documents, the overheard conversation about the affidavit. Victoria's attorney objected repeatedly, claiming everything was hearsay or privileged communication, but Judge Reynolds overruled most of these objections. When Victoria's attorney had the opportunity to cross-examine Diane, his questions focused primarily on her termination, suggesting she was a disgruntled ex-employee seeking revenge. Diane remained composed. "I was fired for questioning unethical practices," she stated simply. "I'm here because what's happening to Ms. Palmer is wrong." After Diane stepped down, I called Elaine Winters to testify about the money trail. She methodically walked through her analysis, showing how Victoria had moved the funds through various accounts, but maintained control over them the entire time. Based on my experience as a forensic accountant and former IRS investigator, Elaine concluded, this pattern of transfers is consistent with someone attempting to obscure the location of funds while maintaining access to them. Victoria's attorney tried to discredit Elaine's methodology, but her decades of experience and meticulous documentation made her a formidable witness. Finally, Angela herself took the stand. She spoke softly but with clarity and dignity about her relationship with Robert, Victoria's increasing presence after his death, and the manipulation that led her to sign documents she didn't fully understand. When asked about her mental state, Angela addressed the court directly. "I'm grieving, Your Honor. There are days when that grief feels overwhelming, but I know who I am. I know what day it is. I know that the money Robert left me was meant to secure my future, not to fund his niece's real estate ventures." Victoria couldn't meet her eyes. When all testimony concluded, Judge Reynolds called a 30-minute recess to review the evidence. As we waited for his return, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Angela sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring straight ahead with quiet determination. Victoria huddled with her legal team, their whispered conversation growing increasingly intense. When Judge Reynolds returned, his expression was grave. "Having reviewed all evidence presented, I'm dismissing the guardianship petition with prejudice." he began. I find not only that it lacks merit, but that it was filed in bad faith as retaliation against Ms. Palmer for challenging Ms. Harrington's financial actions. He turned to Victoria. Ms. Harrington, your conduct in this matter is deeply troubling. You've abused the guardianship system, which exists to protect vulnerable individuals, not to punish those who stand up to financial exploitation. Victoria stared at the table, her jaw clenched. Furthermore, the judge continued, I'm granting Ms. Palmer's petition for full return of all funds, $327,5 plus interest at the statutory rate from the date of first withdrawal. Ms. Harrington remains in contempt of court until these funds are returned in full. He paused, looking directly at Victoria. I'm also referring this matter to the district attorney for investigation of potential criminal charges, including elder financial exploitation, perjury, filing false documents with the court, and abuse of the guardianship process. Additionally, I'm referring Dr. Hendricks to the State Licensing Board for providing a medical opinion outside his area of expertise in a legal proceeding. Victoria's composure finally shattered. This is ridiculous, she burst out, rising halfway from her chair before her attorney pulled her back down. She signed those papers. She knew what she was doing. Judge Reynolds fixed her with a stern gaze. Ms. Harrington, I suggest you remain silent before you make your situation worse. This court has found clear evidence of deliberate deception and exploitation. Your continued protests only reinforced that finding. Victoria fell silent, but the look of hatred she directed at Angela was chilling. As we prepared to leave the courtroom, Victoria's attorney approached us with an unexpected proposal. My client is willing to return the full amount today if Ms. Palmer will sign an agreement not to pursue criminal charges. I was about to refuse outright when Angela touched my arm. Let me think about it, she said quietly. Once we were in the hallway, safely out of earshot, Angela explained her reasoning. I don't want to drag this out for years. I just want my money back and to be left alone. If she returns every penny today, I'd consider it. I explained to Angela that while she could indicate to the district attorney that she didn't wish to pursue charges, the decision ultimately wasn't hers alone. The DA could proceed regardless, especially given the evidence of document falsification and perjury, which were offenses against the court itself. Let me see if I can negotiate something that gives you closure while still holding Victoria accountable, I suggested. Angela agreed, and I arranged to meet Victoria's attorney in a conference room. The negotiation was tense, but productive. Victoria would return the full $327,500 plus $15,435 in calculated interest by 5 p.m. that day. In exchange, Angela would sign a statement indicating she didn't wish to pursue criminal charges related specifically to the financial exploitation. The agreement explicitly stated that this did not prevent the DA from pursuing other charges related to false testimony or documents. Also included a non-contact provision prohibiting Victoria from approaching or communicating with Angela in any way. Victoria's attorney took the proposal to his client while I discussed it with Angela. It's not perfect justice, I told Angela honestly. She should face consequences for what she did. But this guarantees you get your money back immediately, and that she can't contact you again. Angela thought for a moment before nodding. I want to move forward with my life. Robert wouldn't want me spending years in courtrooms fighting his niece. Her wisdom and grace in that moment were humbling. We signed the agreement, and by 4:47 p.m. that afternoon, the full amount plus interest had been transferred to a new account set up solely in Angela's name. I thought that would be the end of our story. I really did. But 3 weeks later, I received a plain manila envelope at my office with no return address. Inside was a single USB drive and a handwritten note that said simply, "Found. This, at the cabin, thought you should have it." I knew immediately it must be from Diane Foster, referring to Victoria's mountain cabin with the hidden safe. I debated whether to look at the contents, aware that they might have been obtained illegally, but my curiosity won out. I plugged the drive into my computer and found a single video file. The video showed Victoria and Marcus Hendricks in what appeared to be an office, dated 2 days before our initial hearing for the emergency injunction. Victoria was speaking candidly about her plans. Once we get the guardianship, We can liquidate everything, the house, the insurance money, all of it. She'll be in a state facility where no one will listen to her anyway. Who cares what happens to her after that? Hendricks looked uncomfortable, but nodded along. Victoria continued, just make sure your affidavit is convincing. I need you to say she was confused, disoriented, whatever medical mumbo-jumbo sounds serious. I don't care if it's true. I need that money for Harrington Heights, and I'm not letting some pathetic old woman stand in my way. I sat frozen, staring at my computer screen, long after the video ended. This was explicit evidence of a conspiracy to defraud Angela and abuse the guardianship process evidence that would certainly lead to criminal charges if provided to the district attorney. But it also raised serious ethical questions. I didn't know how Diane had obtained this video. If she had broken into Victoria's property, the evidence might be inadmissible. And yet, the content was so disturbing that I couldn't simply ignore it. After careful consideration, I decided to contact the district attorney's office without revealing the existence of the video yet. I spoke with Ada Jennifer Miyazaki, who had been assigned to review the case following Judge Reynolds' referral. We're already investigating based on the court records, she informed me. The evidence of perjury and falsified documents is quite strong. Would your client be willing to give a statement? I explained Angela's position that she didn't want to be at the center of a prolonged criminal case, but understood the importance of accountability. Jennifer assured me they would be sensitive to Angela's wishes while fulfilling their obligation to prosecute serious offenses. I decided to wait and see how the investigation proceeded before making any decisions about the video. If the case moved forward based on the existing evidence, perhaps the video wouldn't be necessary. If charges were dropped or minimized, I would reconsider my options, possibly consulting with an ethics expert about the proper course of action. 2 months later, Victoria Harrington was indicted on multiple felony counts, including perjury, filing false documents with the court, attempted exploitation of a vulnerable adult, and abuse of the guardianship process. The indictment was based entirely on the evidence presented during our hearings and subsequent investigation. The video never became part of the official record. Victoria eventually accepted a plea deal that included 2 years of probation, a substantial fine, 500 hours of community service, specifically with elderly residents, and the permanent surrender of her real estate license. The relatively light sentence reflected her lack of prior criminal history, but the professional consequences were severe. Her career was effectively over. Dr. Marcus Hendricks faced separate proceedings before the state licensing board and was ultimately censured and fined for providing false testimony outside his area of expertise. He retained his license, but with restrictions that prohibited him from working with elderly clients or providing any form of capacity assessment. The board's decision noted that while his actions were unethical, they appeared to have been done under pressure rather than from his own initiative. As for Angela, she used a small portion of the recovered funds to repair her roof and update her aging heating system. The rest remained safely invested in conservative, secure accounts that she monitored carefully. She joined a grief support group at her local community center, where she slowly began to rebuild her social connections. 6 months after our case concluded, she volunteered to speak at a senior center about financial exploitation, turning her painful experience into a warning that might protect others. Trust is precious, she told the audience, but verification is essential, even with family. Her story touched many and likely prevented similar schemes from succeeding. Diane Foster found a new position with a reputable property management company where her attention to detail and ethical standards were valued rather than punished. She never publicly acknowledged being the whistleblower in Victoria's case, but I sent her a small plant for her new office with a card that simply said, "Thank you." She understood. As for me, the case changed something fundamental in my approach to my work. I'd always believed in fighting for justice, but Angela's case reminded me of the very personal impact that legal battles have on the people involved. It's easy to get caught up in motions and strategies and forget that at the center of each case is a human being whose life has been upended. I became more attentive to the emotional needs of my clients, more aware of the toll that even successful litigation can take. I still have that weathered manila envelope in my desk drawer, the one Judge Reynolds opened that day in court containing Diane's initial evidence. It serves as a reminder that sometimes justice does prevail, even when the odds seem overwhelming. Sometimes the document that changes everything is the one nobody sees coming. If you're listening to this and you know someone who might be vulnerable to financial exploitation, perhaps an elderly parent or a friend who's recently experienced a loss, please share this story with them. Predators often strike when people are at their most vulnerable, when grief or illness makes it difficult to see clearly. Sometimes the most dangerous threats come from those who should be offering protection. And if you yourself are facing a situation where someone with power or resources is trying to silence you or take what's yours, remember Angela's quiet courage. Remember that standing up for yourself is not selfish, it's necessary. The courtroom fell silent that day, because the evidence spoke a truth that couldn't be denied, a truth about betrayal and greed, yes, but also about resilience and justice. I'm Margaret Davis, and I'm recording this from my office at Lakeside Legal Aid, where the door is always open to those who need someone to fight for them, because everyone deserves an advocate, especially when they're standing against someone who thinks their money or connections place them above the law. Thank you for listening to my story. Please leave a comment about what you would have done in Angela's place. Subscribe if you want to hear more cases from my 40 years of practice, and share this with someone who might need to hear that they're not alone in their fight. Remember, the most powerful weapon against injustice is refusing to be silenced.